Greetings, Darklings, from across the interweb. It is once again I, the Duchess Precious Ken, and I'll tell you what, we have another really exciting interview for today. Lately, it has been kind of Ken, meet your musical heroes who you never thought you'd get a chance to meet. Time on Sounds and Shadows, where we've had several of them lately with John Robb, which you just saw, Voltaire. And today we have one that, for my college years in particular, was a big deal when I knew the goth and was into that, of the Sisters of Mercy, Fields of the Nephilim, Joy Division, things like that. But then something changed that kind of made it a little broader in the definition of what that could mean. And another thing I loved at the time was 4AD bands and kind of shoegaze and things like that. And someone worked to put these ideas together, add in aspects of world beat, which was another thing that I always found very interesting, using instrumentation that wasn't popular in the moment, of, say, like violins and whatnot in dark wave music. And I get a chance now to talk to that person from the band Black Tape for a Blue Girl, Projekt Records. I have with me Sam. Sam, it is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Hi, thanks for taking me on the show today.
So we've talked a little bit about having you come on for a while, and I'm glad we finally worked it out and made it happen. And you've got a lot of exciting stuff coming up to talk about. But start me off a little bit. There was this moment when somewhere along the way, especially because when you talk about a record label on top of doing a band, but while you were doing your band and making music, you said to yourself, I have some bigger piece of the puzzle to put together, and I want to turn that into a record label where I feel like I could lift other people up and give them a spotlight. What was that? And what kind of inspired you towards that part of your journey?
So the very beginning, I was making a fanzine in 82, 83, and it was before the internet. There was no way anyone could actually hear the bands I was writing about because they were all obscure. Most of them weren't even on major labels. They were obscure indie releases. And so I decided to put out a cassette of some of the local electronic bands I was writing about. Yeah. And that was 83. So that was the first project release, even though I didn't know it was a project release at the time. And I'll get this quick. And then in 86 was the first Black Tape for a Blue Girl, which was on vinyl. And then in 89 was the first Black Tape CD. But in between that, started getting distribution on the vinyl releases and connecting with more indie fanzines who were writing about it. So I kind of thought, oh, I have a network here. I could do this for other artists or try it. Yeah. And so the first band I tried was Attrition, who I had first met in 81, I think, when they Third Mind sent one of their 12 inches to my fanzine for a review. And so it was like, okay, let's experiment. Let's see what happens if I put out somebody else. It was on CD at that point. And it did well enough that I was like, oh, this is working. I was still I had just got out of college, but it wasn't like I thought I was running a record label yet. I was mostly putting out my own music. But 90, 91, 92 is when the label just like consumed my life, and I had to stop doing my job to do the label. And so there was a Oyuki Conjugate reissue, but Lycia was the first band that was unknown band who came to Projekt and got put out by Projekt, where Attrition had already had records out for years. Yeah. But so it was sort of like, oh, there's a network here where I could put other things through it. Let's see what could happen.
Wow. So just hearing you say that, you have filled me with hope, because the idea that I didn't know this, you really started it as writing a zine about music, which is kind of what I think of, when I think of Sounds and Shadows and where we started, what we're doing, and converted that platform that you built into being able to sign bands and talk about them. And yes, Lycia was a great example of, that's one of the ones I think of first when I think of Projekt Records, that really hit me hard in the day, where I heard, I was like, I mean, I guess this is goth, but it's something totally different. And the light went on, and all of a sudden my definition became bigger. And I know for you, probably starting out, I don't imagine, especially from when I hear Black Tape for a Blue Girl, I don't hear that and think to myself sonically, this person listened to a lot of Sisters of Mercy and then put out this record. I mean, that might have, but what I hear more is, yeah, your Dead Can Dance. And, I mean, even, shoegaze type stuff is what I hear a lot more of in the influence or the idea of what came together with it. What was it that inspired you to say, what is the sound and why is it different than what was being put out at the time, like you said, when you're reviewing and kind of writing about this stuff, where you had a new idea to put out and that became Black Tape for a Blue Girl?
Well, the maybe 8 or 9 cassettes I released before Black Tape were instrumental, and I would say Brian Eno, Tangerine Dream, and a little OMD probably were the influences on that. So there was, I guess, minimal wave is a term they kind of use for some of that genre now, but I wasn't listening to goth records. I was listening to 4AD, but one of the bands I wrote about, the Sleeper Reason, was Oscar's band, who became the vocalist in Black Tape. And
Right.
so I'm not a singer. I write the melodies, I write the words, but you don't want to hear me sing. So I asked Oscar if he would sing the songs. And I was in California at that point. He was still in Florida. But his influences, I think, would be Bowie, Peter Murphy, Freddie Mercury.
Sure. Brian
Very,
Ferry, like a lot of that, is what I hear it. Yeah.
yeah, Oscar definitely is into the very dramatic vocalists.
Yeah.
And what I loved about the Sleeper Reason, and then Black Tape has had many more releases than Sleeper Reason. They only had an EP at that time. It was that he was willing to go there. He was willing to like push it and sing these very melodramatic things I wanted to write. And so he might have brought in some of a Bauhaus or Peter Murphy influence, but musically it wasn't a rock band.
Right.
It didn't have bass, barely had drums, and some acoustic guitar here and there. But it definitely wasn't what I think of as a goth structure
Sure.
in songs. I remixed the second album recently, and after it, like sort of as my reward, I listened to all the This Mortal Coil albums. I didn't want to listen to them before, and then afterwards I was like, oh yeah, I know what I was listening to back then.
Right.
You could hear This Mortal Coil, you can hear Dead Can Dance to me as things I loved, and then Brian Eno is in there just in the more. I mainly play keyboards, so the electronic side of it and the texture side of it, where This Mortal Coil did texture too, but I think Dead Can Dance is they're much better instrumentalists than I am, so they have more song
Sure.
even in their instrumental areas. And so, and then with Lycia, I mean, I think Mike was listening to what's now called post-punk and Joy Division and maybe Wire and other bands. So I don't think his influence came from the traditional Sisters, Bauhaus, Cure sort of side of things.
Sure.
And so the earliest stuff Mike sent, like what is now the Wake release, was a little bit more, the drums were a little more electronic, where I think by Ionia, the sound of the drums it flowed a little bit more in a natural way, where the earlier one maybe had a little more electronic influence. But yeah. I think neither, and then the third band would be Love Spirals Downwards, who Cocteau Twins sounding, but none of them were like the more rock side of goth, the three main project bands in the 93 era, I guess.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, that is definitely how I found a lot of your stuff. And that was, there was a DJ in Detroit when I was growing up named Darren Ravel. And I think he's out in California now, but he was on
What year was that?
This would have been like late 80s. So like 88 through 91, 92. And he did a show called Big Sonic Heaven. And it was basically a lot of that, the 480, but Projekt Records, and it was every Sunday night. And I remember it was kind of one of those times when you did that like TV, where you would tune into the radio on regular, in your room or whatever at certain times. And it was every Sunday evening at like 8 p.m. And that was the stuff I would hear. And that was, I don't know, where I found a lot of the connection to this music. And to me, a lot of the things you're listing, one of the big connections, and I call it almost like new romanticism. And I know that's a genre or things people say, but it also was a part of, even though the sounds of the bands you're describing are different, there was this central theme of kind of forlorn love lost that, I kind of always came back to the core of a lot of the music. But another aspect is you were doing instrumentals, which a lot of times for a band like that, when you think of The Cure or, somebody else who did romantic style music, it wasn't usually in instrumental songs. It was in lyrics and kind of the poetry of that. But that was always a part of your albums with Black Tape for a Bluegrass. I would say at least 20% or something were usually instrumental songs for every album, right? And what do you think was that by intent, or was that kind of just how the music came out of you?
Oh, I think it's how the music came out. Like I said, the 6 or 8, whatever the number is, early cassettes were all instrumental, and
Yeah.
then Oscar sang 3 songs on the cassette before the rope, and then with the rope, I guess my idea was probably kind of like Low, where one side was the vocal side and one side was the instrumental side,
Huh.
the Bowie Eno album, and
Yeah.
so having instrumental was always part of it. They back then the instrumentals had stories that went with them in the liner notes, so
Right.
there's sort of like you got the musical mood and then you have the poetic mood of the idea, and it's never that, oh, I didn't get around to recording the lyrics. They were intended to be that way.
Yeah.
um, and yeah, so the first album I'd say is half instrumental. Mesmerized by the Sirens is less, and then there's, I guess, the most recent album, The Cleft Serpent, has no instrumentals, but it has instrumental areas within some of the songs, and so yeah, that was always part of it, to
Yeah.
have that. And when I met Vicki Richards, who plays on A Chaos of Desire, not to forget anybody, but she was the first instrumentalist that was amazing, who really stood out, where before it was sort of keyboards and things collaged together. But
Sure.
she was definitely like a lead instrument on the violin. And so that on Chaos of Desire, there's 2/3 of the way through, there's this instrumental area where it's me and Vicky doing these sort of dark things with screaming violins on it. That it's having the mood, but not with a voice, having the mood with an instrument.
And I think that became part of, I don't know, I'd almost say your signature. Like when I would hear the violin or the cello or so, on kind of this cold wave or dark wave set, I would know it was a lot of times a Projekt record if it can included that type of out of the box instrumentation.
Mhm.
So no, I found that very interesting. And I think this segues really well into what I want to talk about next. You've started taking some of these original Black Tape for a Blue Girl and remastering them and re-releasing them here now in 2023. Or hopefully by 2023. I think that's the plan. And what do you think? What was the impetus behind this? Because to me, there has been this rebirth in the scene or kind of renaissance in kind of the dark scene music. And I think you guys are a big part of that. So hearing this come back, what kind of sparked to you? There is a new generation of young people that are really into this music right now and might have missed us. And how do I give that back? Or is it more a feeling of people like me who got a new record player now, an ironic mustache, and I really want to hear it on vinyl. And so this is my chance to get maybe what I only had on a CD because I don't want to listen to it on streaming or Spotify.
Well, the first really giant Kickstarter I did was 2014, which was for the Remnants of a Deeper Purity as a double
Mhm.
LP. And it was successful. And then I just started doing it. And actually, with this one, there's going to be 10 Black Tape vinyl back in print. I mean, no, they weren't ever in print on vinyl before,
Right.
but there'll be 10 vinyl releases. And it's really, when the internet came along and people stopped doing mail order, we still do a mail order catalog, but it's not people writing in letters anymore. I really felt like I lost touch with who was listening to the band. And so there was a lot of this feeling of disconnect from the audience. But then when I started doing Kickstarter, it was meeting all these people who, your age, my age, younger, who've loved the band and were like connecting. And I
Yeah.
just really liked that because it was very like inspirational to actually want to keep doing music, where in the early internet time, it was just felt like you're doing it alone. They go to a distributor. You never know anything about who's listening. And so it was kind of to give back and connecting with these people who love the music, who some of them I've been in touch with for 20 years. Some of them
Sure.
are mail order customers from the 80s. I mean, they're people whose name I've seen on so many boxes going out over the years. But with, it's interesting on the like Spotify demographics for Black Tape, I was surprised that there's as many listeners in their 20s as in their 40s and 50s.
Right, right.
Where other more ambient electronic artists on Projekt, it's really skewed up towards, the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so that was sort of a surprise to see. And then on Twitter, Love Lies Crushing is sort of a noisy shoegazer band on
Yeah.
Projekt. And when I look at who comments, talks about them, who posts them, it's always people in their 20s. And it's just amazing that these records that came out in 94 and 96, somewhere right around there,
Yeah.
have audience who are 10 years younger than the records. It's great. It's great
There's
that people
still these,
bring
even now, these 20-year-old folks out there with 37 pedals on a pedal board and a guitar, that this is still their inspiration to the day. That's awesome.
Yeah. And like I sometimes I'll ask somebody, you're 20 years old, where did you hear my band? And they're like, I was in a used bookstore, I saw it on the shelf, it looked interesting, and I bought it. And a CD's $2 now, right? Used.
Right.
So it's not like you're putting up $20 to find out if you like a band. And it's amazing. I mean, that's how I used to hear music. You'd be in the record store. What is this? It looks cool.
I remember, yeah, like going up to the record store, you're 15, 16, riding my bike up there and walking through and not knowing anything about a band. And it isn't like you can pull your phone out and Google it, but the cover art looked cool as hell.
Mhm.
And you flipped it over and the names of the song, and you're like, $8, I've been caddying. Sure, let's give it a go, And no, there is something about that I love, that's coming back, that I don't know, you can just be inspired by the art, because that's another thing on your label I've always felt was a big part of it, is you had a aesthetic in the same way as kind of this romantic core idea that combined a lot of the bands and music. There was something about the album cover aesthetic too that I always felt was, for Projekt Records, very cohesive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the label total is maybe 650 releases now, and I designed the covers on 80% of them, 90% of them, or something like that. And so, to me, I liked 4AD, but my feeling about 4AD was often they were a little interchangeable from band to band.
Sure.
And I think like the Dead Can Dance ones were pretty iconic in the earliest period. But so for me, it was like, I want each band to be distinct, to look like that band.
Yeah.
So, A Day in the Star Corner by Lycia looks like nothing else on the label. Ionia looks like nothing else on the label. And that to me was important. That gave Lycia their own, their own personality.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's fun to design them, but it's also, a challenge to not make them all look like the last one.
Right. Especially when I hear this, that a lot of that was kind of coming from you. So there really was a, I don't know, central mind theme on it, but at the same time, to keep coming up with something fresh that pops when you've done 20, 30, 50 of them, that's got to get harder and harder.
Well, I kind of try to get the artist to find something they want. I know Susan Jennings did the covers for Ionia, Stark Corner, Soul Whirling Somewhere. We actually don't know who shot the cover of A Day in the Stark Corner, because Susan and I were both using the same camera. So who knows who
either way, but
yeah. But I think it started with her idea to go out to the desert to shoot that because of the desert feel in Mike's music.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting because let's say the 92, 91 to 97 period was about 30 albums out of 650 albums. But that period was also the height of the music industry as far as selling things.
Right.
But like someone finding a used Black Tape CD, well, sure, there's still 100,000 CDs. There's going to be used ones everywhere, And so
there's some downstairs by my record player, the cassette tapes,
Yeah. Oh, and cassettes. I mean, I think I sold 800 cassettes on Ashes in the Brittle Air, And And I don't know if you saw, but I'm pressing mini discs on the
You
releases.
told me about this, and I told you how excited that made me because so I didn't have a CD player. Like I waited really long. I waited till I think 1996 because I thought CDs were a fad.
Uh-huh.
This is going to all blow over. It's not going to. And finally, I broke down. I'm like, okay, I was wrong in 1996 and got a CD player and started buying CDs. Shortly after that, though, mini disc came out, and I said, this is the best technology ever. These are durable, they're small. You can put what, like 10 CDs on them. The vocal
Um,
quality is, I mean, maybe not that much, but
it's 80 minutes at like
yeah,
high quality, but you can, low quality or MP3 quality cram a lot more on there.
true. Well, maybe it was that I was making mixes with a couple of songs for,
Uh-huh.
but either way, you could put a lot on there and it wouldn't degrade like a CD, and the sound quality was higher. I went out like day one and bought the best mini disc player that you could buy and like went all in, converted every album I had. And then, you know, I was
But it
wrong
was
again.
somebody on my in my patron area asked about mini disc, and I was like, why would anyone want a mini disc? And so we were talking about it in there, and I was like, okay, I mean, if you want to pledge it on the Kickstarter and kind of if enough people show me there's a need for
A
this, why
need,
not?
sure.
And so I think this will be the fourth one on mini disc for Mesmerized by the Sirens. And maybe I think I made 50 of each of them, and I'm down to 15 or whatever on the previous one. So there's, it's kind of if that's the format people would like, why not?
I am all for it. I'm for bringing back mini disc in a big way. So you've been doing this Kickstarter, and I think by now, when we're getting this interview, it definitely when it's released, I think you've met your goal, correct? To have this out or very close to it.
Met the goal almost to the stretch goal, which has the second CD. Maybe by now it has. And
Ooh.
so it's going to be a 2 CD release. I sort of go through all my old cassettes and DAT tapes and look for little bits of interesting things. And I found, so on A Teardrop Left Behind,
Yeah.
there's the vocal Oscar sang.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a second vocal, which sounds almost like the first vocal. And I realized that was Oscar's first take because Oscar would sing straight through pretty much. And I'm like, they are almost identical, even though they're different takes. There's just little inflections. And it's like, it's just interesting to hear how prepared he was and how he knew what he wanted to do with that. And then it's like, okay, that word, he didn't quite bend it as much. And the timing is slightly different here. But so there's one track was never released. There's that. There's like a piano thing where I was the original piano recording that's only part of it on the record. So there'll be bonus stuff on the second disc
Nice.
on the CD.
And you also were doing this one on vinyl as well, LP that you're going to put the new release out. So tell me a little bit too about why this album. I mean, I imagine you said you're putting out a lot of this and going through it, but this one, one of the early ones you wanted to do the Kickstarter for and get it out. Why do you feel this one was an iconic example of kind of what the label and you did?
Well, one thing I did with this album is I remixed the whole album I got the half-inch 8-track tape baked, digitized, brought in the computer, then could actually do a really nice mix on it because my mixing skills weren't the best back then in 87. Sure. So there's just so much more warmth to it now, and there's more distinction. So my idea was not to like completely change it, but to try to hear it better than what it was originally mixed. And I think I actually didn't know how many people really loved this album. To me, it seems like it kind of eventually fell through the cracks as the second album.
Yeah.
But there was a lot more interest than I expected in it. And I think it's the performances are better on this album than the first album. I think the songs are better. And so there's many reasons why I've always loved it. It's very dark. I think the third album was a little lighter and the fourth album was dark again. So I think I like the darkness of it. But it's a sort of going through, I guess, all the catalog and sort of cleaning it up. Some of them are just remastered, but making them available again. And it's on vinyl. There's two color options for it. And I think other artists like I look on Spotify. I'm like, oh, when did this deluxe edition of this album come out? And you
Sure.
got like,
I think that's happened a lot right now, for certain.
yeah, it's great, and it's like hearing the different takes of the same song, and it's like it doesn't need to be on vinyl. That doesn't need to be on vinyl. I just
Sure.
want to hear, oh, here they did, or you know, I'm not the biggest Beatles fan, but just hearing stuff you've heard 10 million times and you're sick of, and it's like, oh, that's a really different version of that
Yeah.
they never used. It's just interesting.
No, I'm a huge fan of that. And also actually I'm a big fan of, kind of what I call the Empire Strikes Back effect. That I think a lot of times it tends to be my favorite albums for band is number two. The soft where a lot of people will kind of go against the sophomore up, but to me, the sophomore album is almost always that mixture between Piss and Vinegar and number one, and where you finally find production at the highest quality in number three, where maybe you lose some of the Piss and Vinegar. I tend to think like the darkness of album two is a lot of times what speaks to me the most.
Hmm.
And another thing you brought up there, sure, maybe your skills as a mixer and master have improved over the years, of course, but also technology wise, there are things that today are possible. And I wonder that too, as somebody who I think of is made the most of minimalistic ideas in sound, unlike kind of your Eno or your Bowie or whatever that was all about giant stadium 30 overlapping guitar tracks, big things, you bringing it down to a Bach level of how can I convey the most emotion with the fewest amount of tracks happening, and that was the magic of it. That was the lightning in a bottle. But now when you have this technology where maybe some of that when you started out was by necessity, not necessarily by intent,
Sure.
nowadays it's limitless because the technology makes having the most advanced recording studio in the world pretty cheap in your bedroom.
Sure.
So did that play a big factor into how you look differently at remastering and redoing this, that you had new bells and whistles to play with?
I think it's less the gear and effects that are available now and just the control of the mix. Because so I had an 8-track tape and I was running it through a 12-channel board, and a song might have 3 sections. So in those 30 seconds between the sections, you got to start re-EQing channels to try to have the stuff come back. And I feel like it always was a race to get these close enough to run the whole mix, because I wasn't like slicing the sections together. So
Yeah.
now I can split it into 3 areas on the computer multi-track, and EQ each section properly. And
Yeah.
so it's really the mixing control more than adding some kind of effects, because I didn't really want to over process it in a way that it didn't have before. So it was, I know it's all out there, but it wasn't really about doing that to it, or there's no auto correction on it or anything. It
Right,
was
right.
what was there. But I think that, the Rope was recorded on a cassette Porta Studio, so it's 4 tracks, and one track might have been 3 tracks mashed down into one. So,
Bouncing it. Oh yeah.
oh yeah. So when
I
I
know
go
all
to,
about bouncing a 4-track. That was the way.
yeah, and when I go back to that one, which I think I will try to remix, there's not a lot of options, because it's like all the music's mashed into one track, then there's a vocal track and maybe an instrument, and for some reason one's blank. I'm like, well, I only have so much control over these 3 tracks.
Nowadays, maybe you could deconstruct something like that, but from those days, it's not like you could slice it apart and put it back together in the same way. That's true.
Well, it's weird, because I was reading an article about the Revolver remix after I realized I had this 5-disc version. And they were saying with AI, somehow they're able to separate out mashed together tracks. And I'm like, how? How did you do that? But yeah, they were saying, even if you can just pull out the sound of the guitar and the sound of the other instrument enough where you can sort of stereo place it, you're adding something to it. But yeah, I don't have that technology.
All right. So we are coming up here to the end of part one. We're going to take a brief break here, and then we'll come back. But I'd love to, we've been talking about this remaster, truly, I mean, especially for fans of this, but even if you didn't know before, this was an album that was really important and needs to be heard and checked out, and getting a chance to kind of hear this remastered version and get it, especially if you're a vinyl file and love, I don't know, the ritual to touch it, to smell the sleeve. I don't know, there's some weirdos like me that really want to hold it and watch the needle drop. What is, if you were going to have someone hear this album by Black Tape for a Blue Girl for the first time, what is the track that we can spin out to on part one for people to experience it for the first time?
Well, the track that is getting the most response is the final track on the album, Sirenia Lumuama, which is the title in Finnish.
Sure.
And it's interesting because the one that always stood out to me was Scream My Shallow, because Oscar is so dramatic in that one. But
yes,
I didn't know, because it was way before touring and stuff like that for the band, that actual sort of moody soundscape of the final track is the one that most people are commenting on.
All right. Then that's what we're going to do for part one. Join us back for the whole interview. This has been part one with Sam of Projekt Records and Black Tape for a Blue Girl. And please enjoy the track as we spin out from part one.
Tapahtukoon sinun tahtosi, myös maan päällä niin kuin taivaassa. Anna meille tänään